Redemption Gulch wasn't known for its fancy weddings. Dust devils danced in the streets more often than bouquets, and the saloon saw more celebrating than any church. But Rose knew, deep in her heart, that her wedding to Jebediah was going to be memorable for all the wrong reasons. Rose was a wildflower in a town full of tumbleweeds. She dreamed of adventure, of wide-open spaces and skies that stretched forever. Jebediah, on the other hand, was as sturdy and predictable as a rock. He owned the biggest ranch in the county, and he saw Rose as another possession, something to add to his collection of land and cattle. The wedding was set for Saturday, right after the noon sun reached its peak. Rose could already picture it, the harsh sunlight beating down, the townsfolk staring with a mixture of curiosity and pity, and Jebediah's steely gaze fixed on her, trapping her like a butterfly under glass. She looked out the window of her small room above the general store. The wind howled, carrying whispers of freedom on its breath. But Rose felt like she was drowning, the walls of Redemption Gulch closing in on her. She knew she couldn't go through with it. Marrying Jebediah meant giving up her dreams, her spirit, everything that made her, her. A single tear traced a path down her dusty cheek. She had to find a way out. But how? Jebediah was a powerful man. An escape seemed impossible. He watched her every move. The very idea of running away made her heart pound her chest. As she sat there, hopelessness threatening to consume her, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Aunt Millie, her mother's sister, a woman known for her wild ideas and even wilder inventions. Aunt Millie was the only person in Redemption Gulch who understood Rose's restless spirit. She saw the fire in Rose's eyes, the yearning for something more. "Rose, child," Aunt Millie said, her voice a low rumble. "I hear tell you're looking a bit peaked. That Jebediah got you down." Rose nodded, unable to speak. The words caught in her throat like a lump of coal. Aunt Millie's eyes twinkled. "Well now, don't you fret. Aunt Millie's got a few tricks up her sleeve. We'll get you out of this mess, one way or another." Rose's ears perked up. Aunt Millie always had something interesting up her sleeve. But how had Rose even gotten into this predicament? It wasn't like she had dreamed of marrying a rancher. She remembered the first time she met Jebediah. He had ridden into town, kicking up a cloud of dust, his face grim and set. He'd come to buy supplies at the general store where Rose worked, and his eyes had lingered on her a little too long, making her feel like a prize calf at a cattle auction. He started calling on her, bringing gifts of dried meat and bolts of sturdy cloth. Practical gifts, not romantic ones. He would sit on the porch swing, talking about the weather and the price of beef, never once asking about her dreams or her feelings. He just assumed she would be happy to be his wife, to have a roof over her head and plenty of food on the table. One day, he simply announced that they were getting married. He hadn't proposed, hadn't even asked for her hand. He just stated it as a fact, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Rose, caught off guard, had stammered something about needing time to think, but Jebediah had just chuckled and said, "There's nothing to think about, Rose. It's a good match." And that was that. The wedding was planned, the invitations were sent, and Rose felt like she was being swept away by a force she couldn't control. She tried to talk to Jebediah about her reservations, about her need for freedom and adventure, but he just patted her hand and said, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about such things. I'll take care of everything." His words were meant to be comforting, but they only made her feel more trapped. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a possession, someone to manage his household and bear his children. He saw her as a means to an end, not as a person with her own hopes and desires. Rose shuddered, remembering the way he looked at her, his eyes cold and calculating. It wasn't love she saw in his gaze, but ownership. She knew that if she married him, she would lose herself completely. She would become just another object in his collection, another piece of property to be managed and controlled. The thought was suffocating. No, anything was better than that. She trusted Aunt Millie. She always had. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess. "Aunt Millie," Rose began, her voice barely a whisper, "I can't marry him. I just can't. He doesn't see me, not really. He just sees someone to cook and clean and have his babies. Aunt Millie patted Rose's hand, her eyes filled with understanding. I know, child, I know. Jebediah ain't exactly known for his charm. More like known for his stubbornness, like a mule in a mud pit. Rose managed a weak smile. It's more than that, Aunt Millie. He scares me. He expects me to be obedient. To do whatever he says, whenever he says it. I feel like I'm suffocating. Aunt Millie nodded, her gaze hardening. Well, now, we can't have that, can we? A bright, spirited girl like you, suffocating under the thumb of that ranch-owning tyrant. Rose looked at her aunt, a glimmer of hope flickering in her chest. Do you really think you can help me? Honey, I once convinced a rattlesnake to knit me a pair of socks. Getting you out of this wedding will be a piece of cake, Aunt Millie declared, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Rose couldn't help but giggle. Aunt Millie always had a way of making even the most impossible situations seem manageable. But this was Jebediah, a man who got what he wanted one way or another. But what can we do? Rose asked, her voice laced with doubt. He's watching me. He won't let me leave. Aunt Millie leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We're not going to leave, Rose. We're going to make him think you've left. Rose frowned, confused. What do you mean? Aunt Millie smiled, a wide, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Rose's spine. We're going to fake your death, child. We're going to make Jebediah believe you're gone for good. Rose stared at her aunt, her mouth agape. Fake my death? But how? Leave that to me, Aunt Millie said, her eyes twinkling. I've got a few potions and concoctions tucked away in my cellar that would make a snake shed its skin twice. One of them will make you appear as lifeless as a doornail, just long enough to get you out of Jebediah's clutches. Rose was stunned. It was a crazy plan, a desperate plan, but it was the only one she had. Are you sure it will work? As sure as the sun rises in the east, Aunt Millie said, her voice filled with conviction. Now, let's get to planning. We haven't got much time. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. But as Rose listened to Aunt Millie lay out the details, a strange sense of calm washed over her. It was a risk, a huge one, but it was better than the alternative, a lifetime of misery with Jebediah. Aunt Millie explained that the potion was a carefully guarded family secret, passed down through generations of eccentric women. It was made from a blend of rare herbs and berries, guaranteed to mimic the symptoms of death for a period of 24 hours. You'll appear cold, still, and breathless, Aunt Millie explained, her voice serious. Your heart will barely beat, and your skin will turn pale. It will be convincing, Rose. Very convincing. The hardest part, Aunt Millie said, would be convincing Jebediah. He was a shrewd man, not easily fooled. They would have to make it look like a tragic accident, something sudden and unexpected. They decided that Rose would fall ill the day before the wedding. Aunt Millie would administer the potion, and Rose would be discovered lifeless in her room. The town doctor, a kindly old man who trusted Aunt Millie implicitly, would be easily convinced. But what about after? Rose asked, her voice trembling. What happens when I wake up? Aunt Millie had thought of that too. She had a secret hideaway prepared in her cellar, a small, cozy room stocked with food, water, and books. Rose would stay there until Jebediah had buried her and moved on. Once he's gone, I'll help you escape Redemption Gulch, Aunt Millie promised. We'll pack you a bag, give you some money, and send you on your way. You can start a new life, Rose, a life of your own choosing. Rose imagined herself riding off into the sunset, leaving Jebediah and Redemption Gulch behind. The thought filled her with a mixture of excitement and fear. It was a daunting prospect, starting over in a new place, but it was also incredibly liberating. The next few days were a blur of frantic preparations. Aunt Millie gathered the necessary ingredients for the potion, while Rose wrote a farewell letter to her few friends in town, explaining that she was leaving to pursue her dreams. She couldn't tell them the truth, of course, but she hoped they would understand. As the wedding day drew closer, Rose's anxiety grew. She knew that this was her last chance, her only chance to escape. She had to trust Aunt Millie, and she had to trust the potion. Her life depended on it. The die was cast, and there was no turning back. The day before the wedding dawned gray and ominous, mirroring the storm brewing inside Rose. She woke up with a knot in her stomach, her hands clammy with sweat. Today was the day. Aunt Millie arrived early, carrying a small, corked bottle filled with a murky, purple liquid. The potion. Rose stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. "Are you ready, child?" Aunt Millie asked, her voice gentle. Rose took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." Aunt Millie poured the potion into a small glass and handed it to Rose. The smell was pungent, a mix of sweet berries and earthy herbs. Rose hesitated for a moment, then closed her eyes and swallowed it in one gulp. The taste was awful, bitter and acrid. Rose gagged, but Aunt Millie quickly handed her a glass of water. "Hold it down, child," she said. "It needs to work its magic." Within minutes, Rose began to feel strange. Her limbs grew heavy, her skin felt cold, and her vision blurred. She stumbled and collapsed onto the bed, her body growing numb. Aunt Millie checked her pulse, her brow furrowed with concern. "It's working," she whispered. "Just hold on, Rose. Just a little longer." Rose's breathing slowed, her chest barely rising and falling. Her skin turned pale, almost translucent. She felt like she was drifting away, her consciousness fading into darkness. Aunt Millie carefully arranged Rose's body on the bed, making it look as though she had simply fallen asleep. She then went to fetch the town doctor, a worried expression on her face. Dr. Abernathy arrived a few minutes later, his medical bag in hand. He examined Rose, his face growing grave. He listened to her heart, checked her pulse, and peered into her eyes. I'm afraid she's gone," he said, his voice filled with sadness. "It appears to be some kind of sudden illness. A terrible tragedy." Aunt Millie feigned grief, bursting into tears. "Oh, Rose, my poor, sweet Rose. Gone too soon." Dr. Abernathy patted her shoulder, offering words of comfort. He wrote out a death certificate, confirming that Rose had died of natural causes. The news spread quickly through Redemption Gulch, casting a pall of gloom over the town. Jebediah was informed, and he arrived at the general store, his face a mask of grief. Or was it something else? It was hard to tell. The wedding was off, replaced by a funeral, and Rose was officially, to everyone's knowledge, dead. The funeral was a somber affair. The entire town of Redemption Gulch turned out to pay their respects to the young woman who had been taken too soon. Rose lay in a simple wooden coffin, her face pale and still. Aunt Millie stood beside the coffin, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, putting on a show of grief. Jebediah stood at the front, his face unreadable. He looked more stoic than heartbroken. He didn't shed a tear, didn't utter a word of sorrow. He simply stared at the coffin, his expression a strange mix of grief and something else, something that Aunt Millie couldn't quite decipher. The preacher gave a short sermon, praising Rose's kindness and spirit. He spoke of her dreams and her potential, cut short by a tragic twist of fate. The townsfolk murmured their condolences, offering words of sympathy to Aunt Millie and Jebediah. After the service, the pallbearers carried the coffin to the town's cemetery, a windswept patch of land overlooking the gulch. They lowered Rose into the ground, and the gravedigger began to shovel dirt onto the coffin. Jebediah stepped forward and tossed a handful of dirt onto the coffin, his eyes fixed on the ground. He then turned and walked away, without a word, without a backward glance. Aunt Millie watched him go, a knot of suspicion tightening in her stomach. His behavior was odd, almost detached. He didn't seem like a man who had just lost his bride-to-be. He seemed like a man who was hiding something. The burial was quick, almost too quick. Jebediah had insisted on it, claiming that he couldn't bear to prolong the suffering. Aunt Millie had reluctantly agreed, but now she wondered if he had other reasons for wanting to get it over with. As the last shovelful of dirt was thrown onto the grave, Aunt Millie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Jebediah's calm demeanor, the hasty burial, it all seemed too suspicious. She decided to keep a close eye on him. Something told her that this was far from over. That Jebediah was not as heartbroken as he appeared to be. That he knew something, or suspected something, and that Rose was still in danger, even in death. Or rather, in her fake death. The charade had worked so far, but the game wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. Meanwhile, deep beneath Aunt Millie's general store, Rose stirred. The potion's effects were wearing off. She woke up in a small, dark room, her body stiff and aching. For a moment, she panicked, unsure where she was. Then, she remembered the plan. She was in Aunt Millie's cellar, hidden away from the world, waiting for Jebediah to move on. The room was surprisingly cozy, considering it was a cellar. Aunt Millie had stocked it with blankets, pillows, and a stack of her favorite books. There was even a small lamp, powered by a strange contraption of wires and batteries, one of Aunt Millie's inventions. Rose sat up and stretched, her muscles protesting. She felt weak and disoriented, but otherwise, she was fine. The potion had worked. She was alive, and she was free. Or at least, she would be, soon. She spent the day reading, trying to distract herself from the anxiety that gnawed at her. She missed the sunshine, the fresh air, the simple pleasures of everyday life. She felt like a prisoner in her own hideaway. As the hours passed, Rose began to have doubts. What if Jebediah never moved on? What if he suspected something and came looking for her? What if Aunt Millie's plan failed? She paced the small room, her mind racing. She longed to be outside, to be free, to be herself again. But she knew she had to be patient. She had to trust Aunt Millie. Her life depended on it. That evening, Aunt Millie came down to the cellar, carrying a tray of food. "How are you holding up, child?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm okay," Rose said, forcing a smile. "Just a little restless." Aunt Millie nodded understandingly. "I know it's not easy, being cooped up down here, but it won't be for long. Jebediah seems to be taking it hard. He hasn't left his ranch since the funeral." Rose felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't wanted to hurt Jebediah, but she couldn't marry him. She couldn't sacrifice her own happiness for his sake. "He'll get over it," Aunt Millie said, as if reading her mind. "He's a strong man. He'll find someone else." Rose hoped she was right. She didn't want to cause anyone pain, but she had to protect herself. She had to escape Jebediah's control, even if it meant faking her own death. As Aunt Millie left, Rose couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something was off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew that the danger hadn't passed. Jebediah was still out there, and she wasn't sure what he was capable of. Her heart sank. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Days turned into nights, and the novelty of her secret hideaway began to wear off. Rose missed the simple things she had taken for granted. The warmth of the sun on her skin, the smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the street, the sound of children laughing as they played in the town square. She started to regret her decision, to question whether faking her death had been the right thing to do. Was freedom worth this isolation? Was escaping Jebediah worth the pain she had caused to her friends and neighbors? She knew that they believed she was dead, that they were mourning her loss. The thought made her heart ache. She had always been a good person, a kind and caring friend. Now, she was a deceiver, a trickster, a ghost haunting her own life. She tried to focus on the future, on the new life that awaited her beyond Redemption Gulch. But the future seemed distant and uncertain, a hazy dream that she couldn't quite grasp. The present was all that mattered, and the present was bleak and confining. She spent hours staring at the walls of the cellar, tracing the cracks in the stone with her fingers. She read the same books over and over again, memorizing every word, every sentence. She longed for something new, something exciting, something to break the monotony of her existence. One afternoon, Aunt Millie came down to the cellar with a worried look on her face. "I've heard some troubling news," she said, her voice low. Rose's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "There's talk in town," Aunt Millie said. "Talk about Jebediah visiting your grave every night." Rose frowned. "Visiting my grave? But why?" "That's what I can't figure out," Aunt Millie said. "Some folks say he's grieving, that he can't bear to be away from you. But others say he's suspicious." Rose felt a chill run down her spine. Suspicious? What do they think he suspects? "They don't know," Aunt Millie said. But they say he spends hours at your grave, just standing there, staring at the ground. It's starting to creep people out. Rose's mind raced. What was Jebediah up to? Why was he visiting her grave every night? Was he starting to suspect that she wasn't really dead? We need to be careful, Aunt Millie said. If Jebediah is suspicious, he might try to dig up your grave. We need to be prepared. Rose's eyes widened in fear. Dig up my grave? But that's insane. Maybe, Aunt Millie said. But Jebediah is a desperate man, and a desperate man is capable of anything. That night, Rose couldn't sleep. The thought of Jebediah digging up her grave haunted her. She tossed and turned in her makeshift bed, her mind filled with images of him standing over her coffin, his face contorted with suspicion and anger. She imagined him opening the coffin, discovering that it was empty, that she had tricked him. What would he do then? Would he hunt her down? Would he try to force her to marry him, even if it meant dragging her kicking and screaming to the altar? The rumors about Jebediah's behavior had spread like wildfire through Redemption Gulch. People whispered about him in the saloon, in the general store, in the church. They said he'd become a recluse, rarely leaving his ranch except to visit Rose's grave. Some said he was mad with grief, that he couldn't accept her death. Others said he was obsessed, that he was convinced she was still alive. They said he'd been seen talking to her grave, pleading with her to come back. A few brave souls had even tried to approach him, to offer him comfort and support. But he had brushed them aside, his eyes cold and distant. He seemed lost in his own world, consumed by his own demons. Aunt Millie had tried to reassure Rose, telling her that it was just gossip, that people were always quick to jump to conclusions. But Rose couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She knew that Jebediah was a powerful man, a man used to getting what he wanted, and she knew that he wouldn't give up easily. He would keep searching, keep probing, until he uncovered the truth. As the hours ticked by, Rose's anxiety grew. She felt like a mouse trapped in a cage, waiting for the cat to pounce. She longed to escape, to run away, to disappear into the wilderness. But she knew she couldn't. She had to stay hidden, for her own safety and for Aunt Millie's. Just before dawn, Rose heard a noise outside the cellar door. A faint scratching sound, like someone trying to pick the lock. Her heart leaped in her throat. Was it Jebediah? Had he found her? She held her breath, listening intently. The scratching sound grew louder, more insistent. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the cellar. It wasn't Jebediah. It was Aunt Millie, her face pale with fear. "Rose," she whispered. "He's there. He's at the graveyard. He's digging." Aunt Millie gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "I saw him. He's got a shovel. And he's digging up your grave?" Rose's blood ran cold. This was it, the moment they had both dreaded. Jebediah had finally succumbed to his obsession, his doubt, his need to know the truth. "We have to stop him," Rose said, her voice trembling. "It's too dangerous," Aunt Millie said. "He's a big man, Rose. And he's armed. We can't risk confronting him." "But we can't just let him dig me up," Rose protested. "He'll find out I'm alive. And then what?" "I don't know," Aunt Millie said, her voice filled with despair. "I just don't know what to do." Rose thought for a moment, her mind racing. They couldn't stay hidden in the cellar, waiting for Jebediah to discover their secret. They had to act, to take control of the situation. "I have an idea," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But it's risky." "I'm listening," Aunt Millie said, her eyes fixed on Rose. "We need to move the coffin," Rose said, "before he gets to it. We need to replace it with something else, something that will convince him I'm still dead." Aunt Millie frowned. "Move the coffin? But how? It's heavy, and we can't just carry it through town. Someone will see us." "We'll do it at night," Rose said, "under the cover of darkness. We'll use your wagon, the one you use to haul supplies. We'll cover the coffin with a tarp, and no one will be the wiser." Aunt Millie hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It's crazy, but it might just work." "But what will we put in the coffin?" Rose thought for a moment. "Straw," she said. "We'll fill it with straw. It won't be the same weight as a body, but it'll be close enough to fool him, at least for a little while." They worked quickly and quietly, gathering the necessary supplies. Aunt Millie hitched her wagon to her old, reliable horse, Bess. Rose packed a small bag with food, water, and a few changes of clothes. They knew that once they moved the coffin, there would be no turning back. They would have to leave Redemption Gulch for good. As darkness fell, they crept out of the cellar, their hearts pounding in their chests. The town was quiet, the streets deserted. They made their way to the cemetery, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. They found Jebediah at Rose's grave, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. He was sweating profusely, his muscles straining as he dug deeper and deeper into the ground. He was close to the coffin, very close. Aunt Millie and Rose exchanged a nervous glance. It was now or never. They had to act fast before Jebediah uncovered the truth. They approached Jebediah, their shadows long and menacing in the moonlight. It was time to confront him, to put an end to his obsession. But how? What could they possibly say or do? Jebediah, Aunt Millie called out, her voice echoing through the silent graveyard. Jebediah stopped digging, his head snapping up. He stared at them, his eyes narrowed, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked wild, almost deranged. "What are you doing here, Millie?" he growled, his voice rough. "This is none of your concern." "It is my concern," Aunt Millie said, her voice firm. "Rose was my niece. I won't stand by and watch you desecrate her grave." "Desecrate?" Jebediah scoffed. "I'm just trying to find out the truth." "The truth?" Rose stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "What truth is that, Jebediah?" Jebediah's eyes widened in surprise as he saw Rose. He stared at her, his mouth agape, his shovel clattering to the ground. "Rose?" he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. But you're dead." "No, Jebediah," Rose said, her voice stronger now. "I'm not dead. I faked it." Jebediah's face contorted with anger. "You faked it," he roared. "You lied to me? You made me believe you were dead." "I had no choice," Rose said, her voice pleading. "You wouldn't let me go. You wouldn't let me be myself." "So you decided to trick me?" Jebediah said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "To make a fool of me in front of the whole town." "It wasn't like that," Rose said. "I just wanted to be free." "Free?" Jebediah laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh. "You think you can just run away from your responsibilities? From your obligations?" "I have no obligations to you, Jebediah," Rose said, her voice rising. "I never wanted to marry you. I never loved you." Jebediah's face turned crimson with rage. He took a step towards Rose, his fists clenched. "You will marry me, Rose," he snarled. "I won't let you get away with this. You belong to me." Aunt Millie stepped in front of Rose, shielding her with her body. "Stay away from her, Jebediah," she said, her voice warning. "She doesn't want you. Can't you see that?" "Get out of my way, Millie," Jebediah said, his eyes fixed on Rose. "This is between me and her." "It's between all of us, Jebediah," Aunt Millie said, her voice unwavering. "Rose is a free woman. You have no right to control her, to tell her what to do." Jebediah hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting back and forth between Rose and Aunt Millie. He seemed torn, unsure of what to do. Then, suddenly, he lunged forward, grabbing Rose by the arm. "Let go of me, Jebediah!" Rose screamed, struggling to break free. Aunt Millie reacted quickly, grabbing Jebediah's shovel and swinging it at him with all her might. The shovel connected with his head, sending him crashing to the ground. Jebediah lay motionless on the ground, his eyes closed, a trickle of blood running down his forehead. Rose stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Had Aunt Millie killed him? Aunt Millie rushed to Jebediah's side, checking his pulse. "He's alive," she said, her voice relieved. "But he's out cold." "What do we do now?" Rose asked, her voice trembling. "We leave," Aunt Millie said, her voice firm. "We can't stay here. If he wakes up, he'll come after us." They quickly dragged Jebediah away from the grave and hid him behind a large tombstone. Then they turned their attention to the coffin. "Help me," Aunt Millie said, straining as she tried to lift one end of the heavy wooden box. Together, they managed to lift the coffin out of the grave and onto Aunt Millie's wagon. It was a struggle, their muscles burning with exertion, but they managed to do it without making too much noise. They placed the coffin filled with straw into the empty grave, carefully covering it with dirt. It wasn't a perfect job, but it would have to do. They needed to get out of there before Jebediah woke up. As they were about to leave, Rose had a sudden thought. "Wait," she said. "We need to leave him a message." She rummaged through her bag and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. She quickly scribbled a note and placed it on top of the grave. "What does it say?" Aunt Millie asked, her eyes filled with curiosity. "It says, 'I'm free, Jebediah, and I'm never coming back,'" Rose said, her voice filled with determination. They climbed onto the wagon, and Aunt Millie urged Bess forward. The wagon creaked and groaned as it lumbered down the dirt road, leaving the graveyard behind. As they reached the edge of town, they heard a shout behind them. They turned around and saw Jebediah standing in the graveyard, his face contorted with rage. He had woken up, discovered the empty coffin, and read Rose's message. "Rose," he screamed, his voice filled with fury. "You can't escape me. I'll find you. I'll hunt you down." Aunt Millie whipped the reins, urging Bess to go faster. The wagon picked up speed, racing away from Redemption Gulch, away from Jebediah, away from the life Rose had known. As they disappeared into the darkness, Rose looked back at the town one last time. She knew that she was leaving behind everything she had ever known, but she also knew that she was finally free. She was finally in control of her own destiny. But Jebediah's words echoed in her ears, filling her with dread. He had vowed to find her, to hunt her down, and Rose knew that he would stop at nothing to get her back. The chase was on. Jebediah, fueled by rage and a burning desire for revenge, didn't waste any time. He saddled his fastest horse, a fiery steed named Diablo, and set off in pursuit of Rose and Aunt Millie. He knew the back roads and hidden trails better than anyone. He cut through fields, crossed rivers, and climbed mountains, determined to catch up with them. The chase was on, a desperate race against time. Rose and Aunt Millie urged Bess onward, but the old horse was no match for Diablo's speed and stamina. Jebediah gained ground quickly, his eyes fixed on the distant wagon. He could almost taste victory, almost feel Rose's hand in his. As they reached the outskirts of Redemption Gulch, Aunt Millie made a sharp turn, veering off the main road and onto a narrow, winding path that led into the mountains. It was a dangerous move, but it was their only chance. The path was rough and uneven, filled with rocks and fallen trees. Jebediah would have a hard time navigating it on horseback, but Jebediah was relentless. He urged Diablo onward, ignoring the dangers of the path. He was determined to catch Rose, no matter the cost. The wagon bounced and swayed as it careened through the mountains, Rose and Aunt Millie clinging on for dear life. They could hear Diablo's hooves pounding behind them, growing closer with each passing moment. Suddenly, the wagon hit a large rock, sending Rose flying off the back. She landed hard on the ground, her head hitting a tree stump. She lay there, dazed and disoriented, as Jebediah approached. Aunt Millie reined in Bess, her eyes filled with panic. She knew she couldn't leave Rose behind, but she also knew that Jebediah was too strong to fight. She had to think fast to come up with a plan. She scanned her surroundings, looking for anything that could give them an advantage. She spotted a narrow canyon ahead, a deep crevice in the earth that was barely wide enough for the wagon to pass through. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try. She whipped the reins again, urging Bess forward. The wagon lurched forward, heading straight for the canyon. Jebediah saw what Aunt Millie was planning and let out a roar of fury. He spurred Diablo onward, determined to stop them before they reached the canyon. But it was too late. Aunt Millie steered the wagon into the canyon, the wheels scraping against the sides of the narrow passageway. Jebediah reined in Diablo at the edge of the canyon, his face contorted with rage. He couldn't follow them. The canyon was too narrow, too dangerous. Rose, still lying on the ground, watched as Jebediah dismounted Diablo and approached her. She knew that she was trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Jebediah had finally caught her. The game was over. Or was it? Perhaps there was one last chance. Jebediah reached down and grabbed Rose's arm, pulling her to her feet. "You're coming with me, Rose," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You belong to me." Just then, a loud gunshot rang out, echoing through the mountains. Jebediah released his grip, clutching his shoulder. He staggered back, his face contorted with pain and surprise. Standing at the edge of the canyon, a rifle in her hands, was Aunt Millie. She had managed to stop the wagon and climb back down the path, determined to protect Rose. "Get away from her, Jebediah," Aunt Millie yelled, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let you hurt her." Jebediah glared at Aunt Millie, his eyes filled with hatred. "You'll pay for this, Millie," he snarled. "You'll both pay." Just then, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, galloping towards them at full speed. They were the townspeople of Redemption Gulch, led by Sheriff Brody. They had heard the rumors about Jebediah's obsession, and they had seen him ride off in pursuit of Rose and Aunt Millie. They knew that something terrible was about to happen, and they had come to stop it. As the riders approached, Jebediah realized that he was outnumbered. He knew that he couldn't win. He turned and ran, disappearing into the mountains. Sheriff Brody dismounted his horse and rushed to Rose's side, helping her to her feet. "Are you all right, Rose?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm okay," Rose said, her voice trembling. "But Jebediah, he's gone crazy." Sheriff Brody nodded grimly. "We know," he said. "We'll find him, Rose. We won't let him hurt you again." The townspeople gathered around Rose and Aunt Millie, offering words of comfort and support. They had always been suspicious of Jebediah, and they were relieved that Rose had finally escaped his clutches. As they were about to leave, Rose had a sudden realization. She couldn't run away from her problems. She had to face them, to stand up for herself, to show Jebediah that she was not afraid of him. "Wait," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not running anymore." "What do you mean, Rose?" Aunt Millie asked, her eyes filled with confusion. "I'm going back to Redemption Gulch," Rose said. "I'm going to tell everyone the truth about Jebediah. I'm going to show them what he really is." Aunt Millie and Sheriff Brody exchanged a nervous glance. They knew that it was a dangerous plan, but they also knew that Rose was determined. "Are you sure about this, Rose?" Sheriff Brody asked. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Rose said, her eyes shining with determination. "It's time to face my fears, to stand up for what's right. It's time to take back my life." She turned and faced the townspeople, her voice ringing with confidence. "Come on," she said. "Let's go back to Redemption Gulch. It's time for a showdown." The townspeople cheered, their voices filled with excitement and support. They mounted their horses and turned back towards Redemption Gulch, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they rode back into town, Rose felt a sense of empowerment wash over her. She was no longer the frightened, helpless girl who had faked her own death to escape Jebediah. She was a strong, courageous woman who was ready to fight for her freedom. And she knew that, with the support of her friends and neighbors, she could. As Rose and the townspeople rode into Redemption Gulch, they found the streets deserted. A hush had fallen over the town, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. They rode to the center of town, stopping in front of the saloon. Rose dismounted her horse and stood tall, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Jebediah," she called out, her voice ringing through the silent town. "I know you're here. Come out and face me." A moment later, Jebediah appeared, stepping out of the shadows of the saloon. He looked haggard and disheveled, his clothes torn, his face covered in dirt. But his eyes were still burning with rage. "So, you've come back," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought you were smarter than that, Rose." "I'm not afraid of you, Jebediah," Rose said, her voice firm. "I'm not going to let you control me anymore." "Control you?" Jebediah laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh. "I was just trying to protect you, Rose. To give you a good life." "A good life?" Rose scoffed. "You wanted to imprison me, to turn me into your possession. I'd rather die than live like that." "You're being foolish, Rose," Jebediah said, his voice softening slightly. "We could have been happy together. We could have had everything." Happiness can't be forced, Jebediah, Rose said. It has to be freely given, and I can never be happy with you. Jebediah's face turned crimson with rage. He reached into his coat and pulled out a gun, pointing at Rose. If I can't have you, no one can, he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. The townspeople gasped, their hands reaching for their own weapons. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, trying to reason with Jebediah. Put the gun down, Jebediah, he said, his voice calm but firm. This doesn't have to end this way. But Jebediah was beyond reason. He was consumed by his obsession, his desire to control Rose. He was determined to have her, even if it meant killing her. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, Aunt Millie stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. You won't hurt her, Jebediah, she said, her voice filled with determination. I won't let you. She reached into her bag and pulled out a strange contraption, one of her many inventions. It was a small, handheld device with a long, thin barrel. What is that? Jebediah asked, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. It's my latest invention, Aunt Millie said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. I call it the Truth Serum gun. Truth Serum? Jebediah scoffed. Don't be ridiculous, Millie. That's just a bunch of hocus pocus. Maybe, Aunt Millie said, her voice teasing. But are you willing to take the risk? She aimed the gun at Jebediah and pulled the trigger. A small dart shot out of the barrel, hitting Jebediah in the arm. Jebediah staggered back, clutching his arm. He felt a strange sensation wash over him, a feeling of dizziness and disorientation. What did you do to me, Millie? He gasped, his voice slurring. I just gave you a little dose of the truth, Aunt Millie said, her voice triumphant. Now, tell everyone the truth about yourself, Jebediah. Tell them what you really are. Jebediah hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting back and forth between Rose and the townspeople. Then, the words began to pour out of him, like a dam had burst. He confessed to manipulating Rose, to controlling her every move, to seeing her as nothing more than a possession. He admitted to bribing the town doctor to declare her dead, hoping to inherit her share of the general store. He even revealed his plans to sell off her land and leave Redemption Gulch forever. The townspeople gasped, their faces filled with shock and disgust. They had always known that Jebediah was a stern and unforgiving man, but they had never imagined that he was capable of such cruelty and deceit. As Jebediah continued to babble, revealing his darkest secrets, the townspeople began to turn against him. They shouted insults, hurled accusations, and demanded that he leave Redemption Gulch immediately. Jebediah, realizing that he had lost everything, hung his head in shame. He turned and stumbled away, disappearing into the shadows of the saloon, never to be seen again. Rose watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. She had finally freed herself from his control, but she knew that she would never forget the pain and suffering he had caused. As the dust settled, the townspeople gathered around Rose, offering words of apology and support. They had been blind to Jebediah's true nature, but they were grateful that Rose had opened their eyes. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his face filled with admiration. "You're a brave woman, Rose," he said. "You stood up to Jebediah, even when it meant risking your own life." "I couldn't have done it without you," Rose said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And without Aunt Millie." Aunt Millie smiled, her eyes twinkling with pride. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" she said. As the days passed, Redemption Gulch began to heal. The townspeople came together, supporting each other and building a stronger, more united community. Rose, meanwhile, started a new life. She took over her share of the general store, running it with kindness and compassion. She became a pillar of the community, helping those in need and always standing up for what was right. And as time went on, Rose found love again. Not the controlling, possessive love of Jebediah, but a true, genuine love that was freely given and freely received. Some say she fell in love with the kind-hearted store owner from the next town over, a man who saw her for who she was, a strong, independent woman with a spirit as wild as the West itself. Others say she found love with Sheriff Brody, the brave and honorable lawman who had always been there to protect her. But whoever she chose, Rose knew that she had finally found happiness. She had escaped the clutches of Jebediah, faced her fears, and taken back her life. She was finally free, and as she looked out at the setting sun, casting its golden glow over Redemption Gulch, Rose knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She was home. The end.